Hello, and welcome to episode 300 of the Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on latest decks, trends, and strategies for the casual spike. My name is Richard Garfield, and I'm here. Sorry.
That's perfect.
It's all good.
It's all good.
Perfect. Hello and welcome to episode 300 of the Dive Down, a Magic the Gathering podcast focused on the latest decks, trends, strategies, and game designers for the casual spike. My name is Stanislav here in Chicago, and with me on the line from Denver, Colorado, it's the one and only Shane Beeps.
But Stan, we had Richard Garfield already introduce the show.
Who? He's here?
He's
standing right behind you, Dave.
peek behind the curtain. He was here,
Right.
and we did a nice interview with him that I was actually fascinated with in a lot of sections, if not most.
All of it. It's
And-
all bangers, Shane. All killer, no filler.
All killer, no
Shane.
filler. So now we are recording this intro after the fact because we would not have the good doctor sit through our ad spot
Yes, or
unless he wants to buy some good deck boxes.
you know, I also didn't want to have to explain to him why we call Dave the Godfather,
Godfather.
Yeah,
or why we call Devin the Doomwake.
Yeah,
right.
that's me,
The Doomwake.
the one and only.
Though maybe it would have been nice to tell him about Heavy Play,
Yes.
the card gaming accessory brand that's going to improve your gameplay and your game day. I'm sure a lot of Richard Garfield games use cards that are templated in such a way that they would fit into Heavy Play.
True. I do want to say, before we go on through this ad read, 300th episode. I know
Yeah,
we
we
just
should
got done
probably-
talking with
We gotta
Richard
hype it up.
Garfield. No, I'm not. All I'm going to say is Heavy Play. Thank you for being such great partners to us over the past 100 episodes of the Dive Down. If you really think about it, they've been with us since close to
That's
episode
bonkers.
200. It's been almost 2 years. And so, Randy, team at Heavy Play, thank you so much. Hope you enjoy listening to Richard Garfield talk about your products. He doesn't do that. We tried. But really appreciate the partnership and really appreciate your ABC system. Stan, tell us the ABC again.
Yes, the ABC system to attach, bundle, and carry your deck boxes to your dice trays, to your playmat. It's awesome. And if you want to try it for yourself, you can use our promo code at heavyplay.com. Use code TheDiveDown2024 for 10% off your first order at Heavy Play.
Stanislav, you did go into the ad read faster than I anticipated, which is fine. But I think, like Dave was starting to get at, I think it's like, yes, this is episode 300. We've done 300 of the Dive Downs. And I don't know how we pulled that off, but we did. I don't know how Stan pulled off getting Richard Garfield in the room, the digital room, but we did. And the only reason that we're still here is because we have an amazing base of listeners that, in the community and people that are engaged with what we're doing, and we're engaged with each other doing what we're doing. And I couldn't be happier and prouder to have made it this far. Y'all.
Yes.
Just putting that out there, making myself emotionally available for you.
Yeah, and I have to say I haven't been with the Dive Down for nearly as long as these individuals, but I really appreciate them reaching out to me and giving me the opportunity to kind of speak and have these conversations, because it really has just made me a much better person, really. Just kind of just looking at it from a different perspective. And I love you guys, and I love the listeners. Thank you guys for listening.
Damn, Devin.
We love you too.
Oh, I got real. Oh, man. No, while we're here, we're episode 300. Let's just do this. Devin, when scheduling got bumpy with Stan overseas and, just a lot of stuff, and it being like a bumpier ride than it was before. And I think you really came in and offered a lot to us, the listeners, and really kept this ship, floating as high as it was before. So we truly appreciate your presence as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think the listeners are in for a real treat with this one.
Yes, we did get the Dr. Richard Garfield on the line all the way from Australia, where he lives now. I'm not doxing him. He mentions this as well during the conversation. And we had an opportunity to talk to him about the history of Magic the Gathering, game design at large, other games that he's playing right now that he really likes very much as we do, including Balatro is back on the Dive Down. It's available on mobile now. Everyone should be playing it.
Absolutely.
We're a Dwarf Fortress podcast now, guys.
Yeah, I think we've changed to a Dwarf Fortress podcast, or perhaps a Chaos Agents podcast. So you should keep an eye out for that.
Yeah. Every 100th episode, we try to do something really special. In the past, we've done 100 decks. We've done 200 cards. It's hard to top that. So that's why we decided to look.
300 questions for Richard Garfield.
That is what we should have done.
He would have hung up immediately. He was very nice and gracious with his time, but I think that might have been too far.
I don't know if or how or when we'll do episode 400, how we can possibly top what we've accomplished today, but we're really excited to share this conversation with all of you. And so without further ado, let's just jump back in to our conversation with the inventor of Magic the Gathering, Dr. Richard Garfield. So, Dr. Richard Garfield, may I call you doctor? Do you prefer Richard or Mr. Garfield?
I just prefer Richard. Yeah, there was a early on a joke where they kept on, my Ph.D. kept getting into the rules, and I felt like my understanding of it is that you shouldn't really use doctor except in association with what you're a doctor of, and so it felt a little bit out of place.
I am a doctor of podcasting, so I would prefer.
Okay.
Whenever we have a guest on the show, we do a lightning round called Inside the Grinder Studio. But you've made it clear to us you don't really keep up with Magic the Gathering's day to day, and I certainly don't take you for a Magic tournament grinder these days. So we'll just abridge it, and we want to ask you two really quick questions. And the first question we always ask any new guest: what's your favorite Magic the Gathering card?
Well, I've got certainly a number to choose from. I always like the meta cards a lot. And my go-to meta card is Scheherazade, which is from Arabian Nights. And with Scheherazade, you play a sub-game of Magic, and whoever wins that sub-game gets a bonus in the overgame. And the reason I like it a lot is because it is very meta. It also was when I was first learning to connect games with other IPs and trying to reflect Arabian Nights with Magic cards was exciting and a challenge. And I had mixed success with it. Sometimes I was happy, sometimes I wasn't. But with Scheherazade, she's always telling stories within stories, and she does that in order to survive the night. And so having a card where you play games within games felt really appropriate.
That's awesome. What's a card that you maybe feel like you don't like as much? If we had to say one that you're kind of like, this is one of the ones I don't feel like was as successful. Just when you imagine.
Oh, well, of the ones of my design would be things like Raging River and Illusionary Mask, which are often have a good spirit behind them, but are so complicated. Anytime you have to go to whatever it is, 6-point font, I'd say I have problems with that.
So every new Magic card.
Yeah. Yeah.
From later days, cards I didn't design, I hate it when there's a card which every deck has to have. It's not as bad when it's a colored card, because then it'll only appear in those decks at least. But when it's an artifact or a land, that's really bad, because that undermines the whole value proposition of a trading card game where there's variety in the decks. So.
Yeah, I love that answer. I mean, I think, Obviously, you said you're not kind of like up to date on exactly what's going on, but there's certainly a couple of things like that floating
Are
around.
you sure you're not paying attention to contemporary modern Magic?
No, the cards in my head are so old now that I'm sure it's not contemporary. But I will say, back when we were setting up how development and design of Magic worked, there was a point where on the table was the proposition that the developers would get bonuses based on how few cards were banned. And I pushed against that.
That's very cool.
I pushed against that because I felt like it was actually easy not to get cards banned, and that they would be making the most boring sets ever. And obviously too many being banned is bad, but I floated this idea that there was a sweet spot that you should expect to have one or two banned every season or something like that, and then they're sort of pressing the limits, but still being responsible.
We'll make time to go into some history of Magic development, but just since you brought up the notion of bannings early in the development cycle, how soon after Magic first became a publicly played game did the notion of a ban even come into conversation?
Informally, the notion of a ban came up very quickly because everybody had ideas. I mean, when Magic first came out, of course, there were not even any deck construction limits other than, I think, a minimum number of cards. So you could play with all lightning bolts if you liked. And so people not only talked about ways to control what was constructed as far as whether there should be 4 of something or 1 of something or 1 of artifacts but 4 of everything else, but it's a natural outcrop of that to start talking about banning particular cards, which I'm a big believer in players taking ownership and control of their play environment, and so it was something I was supportive of. If you don't like a card, or want it to work differently, I felt like your community should work with that. Now, Magic sort of went into spaces which I hadn't anticipated, because when you have a community all trying to play the same game, that philosophy doesn't necessarily play as well. But I still encourage that for people playing around a kitchen table. If they don't like a particular card, they should make their own banned list.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of how people encourage Commander as a format to be played too, for sure, which is kind of like, hey, what your house says, you should have conversations about your house rules and kind of go from there, which is a cool thing to see people carry through. I guess we would love to talk a little bit about the very beginning of Magic, just to hear maybe a little bit of that story. So there's a story that perhaps you came up with a game where you were going on a hike near where you were living at the time. Can you describe that moment, or is there a moment that you remember when the idea first started to form?
Oh, yeah. No, this is most of my game development is evolution, but there are a few key moments which are revolution, and there was an aha moment which was at Multnomah Falls outside of Portland, Oregon, and it that's where it's hit me that not all the players had to be playing with the same deck, and I just felt like sort of the idea of all the things you could do with that from a designer's point of view overwhelmed me, and that's not at all typical for my game design. Usually, I'm trying things out and changing them and tweaking them and mixing things up, and I don't know exactly where it's going to go. That was a single moment which sort of knocked me off my feet. And it always is sobering for me to think back to that time and recall that when I told Peter Adkison about it, the president of Wizards of the Coast, I told him that he was very excited by it as well, but I told him that he should restrain his enthusiasm because I didn't know whether it was possible to design such a game. And the reason why that's sobering is because, of course, it's so obvious now, and there's so many ways to do it. And but but at the time I was thinking, well, like if you play poker and you can choose your own cards, that's not fun. And if you play chess and you can choose your own pieces, that's not fun. And so there were some hurdles that I had to get over before I could see what I was really aiming for.
I've been to Multnomah Falls and I did not create a hit card game. I feel like I missed my opportunity.
You didn't go on that path, apparently.
Well, there's one exact spot,
The step not taken.
Yeah. So what you described that moment where it kind of broke through, was there a moment before that? So when you're talking about that, did you already have ideas like we're going to lands and casting costs and all of those kind of things kind of floating around even before that moment, or did it really start with that kind of people can customize their own journey?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did actually have a card game that I was working on since I was an undergraduate, so say 82, which was a magical themed game that had a lot of the elements, including the relationship between land and spells and creatures. At the time, though, when I had this aha, I wasn't thinking of that game at all. And in fact, in the following months, my measure of time back then is a bit hazy, but I think it was over the following months, I came up with prototypes that had nothing to do with a magic-themed card game. I had like a dungeon crawl game and one where you were using cards to pick locks and you were assembling your own defenses for your locks. So I was exploring other IPs, but then at some point it hit me that this magic game that I'd been working on for a long time would make a good framework for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting to hear, all of the different ways that you iterated the work of design, right? Like that's a craft. Are you constantly kind of just thinking about new games, new mechanics? Is it just sort of something that's on your mind all the time, or kind of how does that process work for you?
Yeah. I'm thinking about games pretty much all the time. I love exploring new mechanics and drafting things that test them. I've long ago given up the notion that I can predict how it's going to turn out. It's one of the things I love about games, but that they are so procedurally generated. There's stuff comes out of them that you don't expect, and so there's nothing like getting actually getting a prototype and getting some players. And this isn't just my own designs. I really love exploring other people's designs as well, seeing where they're taking things. I see us all as working on this wonderful project of games, and it's a sort of a team effort, and there's it's a lot of it just is perpetually exciting and interesting.
What was designing, because you're still a game designer, and I mean, I know a few people who have been doing some game designs and like participating like in incubation spaces and collaboration spaces. How was designing Magic and other games back in the late 80s, early 90s, and how different is the way you design games today, do you think? Like what's changed for you and how you design games?
Well, there's probably a lot of things. There are a lot of things. So to name a few, first of all, my life recently has been way more sequestered than it was 8 years ago, and so I get less opportunity to play face to face, and so I do a lot of digital design using Tabletop Simulator. Another big difference is that I have contact with lots and lots of different publishers who are interested in my ideas, and so it's not. It's certainly some people think that I can go to a publisher and bring them an idea and they'll publish it, and that's not at all the way it is. But it's but but it's just wonderful to be able to have the ear of a publisher and say, look at this game, what do you think, and get their feedback, and occasionally getting it published with them. Another big difference is this might be the biggest, is the community of players and designers is so much bigger and more sophisticated than it was when I was starting out. We really are in a golden age of games, and it's hard not to have that in mind when you go to the game store, or when you begin having online conversations with people. People are much more sophisticated in the way they think about games, which is 90% a good thing, but there is 10% bad in that people begin to prescribe more. They're often less open to new things because they see how things should be done and try to keep it inside the band that they view as correct. So on balance, this is the world I want to be in. I love a sophisticated player base and a lot of good designers and developers out there, but sometimes I do believe that that it's a little bit rigid.
That's a great time, as good a time as any, I think, to maybe ask you to go back in time and tell us a little bit about working on like the original design of Magic. Like how would you describe the process of going like from your original idea to having an alpha product?
Well, as I mentioned, I had this epiphany at Multnomah Falls, and then there was a few weeks, couple months of fooling around with prototypes when I connected it with this Magic game framework that I'd been working on. From that point, my recollection is that it was pretty fast. That the design fell out very fast. I had so a couple days, and
Wow.
and I had a deck of, I think, 120 cards, and we shuffled it together, and I split it between my pal and me, and we played 60 each, but it was from this random thing, and it was playing very well. We played all night, and within a few weeks, I had taken the step of saying, okay, let's make lots of different decks and distribute them among the other graduate students and people at the Bridge Club, and yeah, and so that was the timeline at the very beginning for Magic.
What was that feeling? Like, how did you know that you were onto something when you got to that moment? What was that feeling like?
Oh, I was very excited by the game space I was developing. It was working very well. We were having a lot of fun. I loved seeing the emergent behavior of the players, like how the players would trade cards and how the value of the cards would go up and down constantly through the week, and what drove that. The point there was a I think there was a little bit of time before I felt I sort of got my head out of my own private development and playtester group and began to think, wow, this game could really affect a lot of people, and I think it could be really successful. And part of that was because the playtesters just wouldn't let it go. They played it with dedication and enthusiasm for 2 years before it was finally printed, and then they played it once it was printed. And there's a lot of players, in fact, a lot of people who are outside the game. I imagine probably some people inside the game that think that the game requires new cards influx in order to make it interesting. And that was, there was a lot of evidence there that that is not the case. The players who were playing it were playing pretty much with the same cards for 2 years, and when they were printed, those cards were the same, and it was perpetually interesting. Now, the new cards is something which really adds to the variety and makes the game very interesting, but it isn't required.
Can a game last for 30 plus years if you don't inject it with expansions along the way?
Oh, absolutely. A game in principle can, because you've got things like Scrabble, which are never going away, or poker. Can a trading card game? I believe it can. I don't know whether the audience has grown sophisticated enough that the first set that was published probably wouldn't do it, but I think players can play with the same set of, say 300 cards indefinitely, right? They would be making their own commander decks or drafting them, or playing a cube, or doing a limited construction. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing that Magic is not just a system, or not just a game where that two people play against each other, maybe the way that those playtesters originally did. Like you mentioned, a bunch of variants right there, limited, cube, those things. Were those kind of variants popping out with the people that were just playtesting too? I imagine they probably were. What do you remember any of the variants and the ways that people were playing during that playtesting period?
Yeah. At the beginning, the way I pictured the game being played was that people would buy one deck and a booster, maybe, or maybe my model for what a rich play group would be about 20 people getting 5 decks each. That
Right.
was like on the very extreme, and so a lot of our play test was around that idea that you're going to have a few decks and you're going to trade. Later in the playtest process, we started opening it up and making it so, okay, you can get whatever card you like just for fun. And the playtesters began to come up with ways of drafting them. Some of my playtest groups were in the Stratomatic baseball, and they were the first ones to do drafts, because in Stratomatic, of course, you draft your players, and that's a very deep part of the game, and it's very natural to apply that sort of thinking to Magic, and they did, and it was a blast. So that's where you started to see the development there. And then early on, there were just so many different drafts we were playing with, and multiplayer formats, team versions. A lot of people don't know, but I played several games with over 50 people, one with over 100 people. That was a version called
That's a
single
EDH
game?
pod.
a single game. It was called
Wow.
we called it the Grand Melee, and the way it worked was you obviously it would take too long if you just went around. So what we had judges stand behind every fifth person, and so every fifth person was taking their turn at the same time, and you could only affect your neighbors. I forget whether the range was 1 or 2 people, but then as people got eliminated, you would drop judges, and so the circle would collapse. Very exciting, very long, very crazy.
It's like a poker tournament.
And
It's like
yeah.
Fortnite is what it is.
it's-
Like
yeah,
the
Battle
ring is
Royale.
closing
Yeah,
on
literally.
you. It's a battle royale. Yeah,
That's funny.
that's fascinating. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, I started playing Magic with Revised, so in 94, I think, might have been 93. And I just remember when we started playing, we came up with all these variants, like everybody's going to have a single color deck and you're going to sit at the points of the star. And it was like these things sort of emerged out of the game without any guidance from anywhere. You know what I mean? It's like we just had this system and we were just exploring all the different ways to do it. It was one of the fascinating things about Magic. I did want to go back to something you kind of said at the beginning with that design challenge of bringing in other ideas, like when you were talking about Arabian Nights. It's interesting that we're kind of entering this era of Magic where there's lots of other kind of stories starting to pop into it as well. Is that the kind of design challenge that you find interesting for the team who's still working on Magic right now, to try to figure out like, oh, what are we going to do with Lord of the Rings and things like that? Do you have any thoughts on that kind of stuff?
I'm sure it's an interesting design challenge. I'm not sure whether they would enjoy it or not. I've got a mixed feeling about doing licensed products. Um,
Hmm.
the Arabian Nights is sort of nice because there's no Arabian Nights licensor who's breathing down your neck about how it's being presented, and and so
Sure.
I can be true to my vision of Arabian Nights and try to honor the original, but there's not committees involved, and I've worked with IPs where it's been very smooth, and ones where it's been a nightmare, and as a player, I I have a hard time often with licenses. Um, but but that said, I did actually get the chance to play some of the
Yeah, Assassin's
uh,
Creed.
Oh, Assassin's Creed.
Assassin's Creed. Yeah, yeah. My uh, twin boys are 7 years old, and they got their first Magic decks, and those were them. And
Oh,
you
wow.
know, it's some of the mechanics in it were very clever, and it's really very rewarding when you can figure out how to elegantly represent some other IP inside your game. So at that level, yeah, I think they would enjoy that.
Did they get those decks because they're fans of Assassin's Creed, or they think it's cool that you invented the game?
They got those decks because I did an appearance at a local Magic tournament, and the people who were running it gave them those decks.
Was that the last time you played Magic? Or if not, when was the last time you played?
Well, the last time was with my boys, teaching them how to play. Before that, well, we're living in Australia now, and it was before we moved here, so it was probably a couple years ago. Usually, when I actually played, and my, which sounds like a long time, and it is a long time, but throughout the history of Magic, I've stepped away from it for a couple years, then gone back, and part of the reason for that is that it can so easily absorb one's life. And that's even more so as a designer. I haven't designed for probably close to 10 years now, and I will, with any luck, go back and design some more sets. But um, it's on the one hand very satisfying designing it. On the other hand, it's it's easy to get have that take over your life. The reason it's satisfying is because unlike most of my design, there's a lot of people who are experts at it, and you immediately know if you've got something that's worth exploring. When I'm working on one of my other games, I don't know whether it's going to be any good, and it takes a long time to sort of get to the nugget of what I'm after or to figure out what's going on. With Magic, it's easy, fun, rewarding, fast.
Are you surprised still at this point in time that there's so, I mean, hard to say. Are you surprised that at 30 years in that there's so many people that are still finding new things to do with the mechanics in the game? Or are you just kind of, at this point, are you kind of like, yeah, makes sense. I mean, it's just a system that lots of people can do stuff with.
Uh, yeah, that did the how robust Magic was as far as being able to design new mechanics within it did perpetually. I knew it was a lot combinatorially. My training is as a combinatorist, so I knew it was going to be rich, but it actually went way beyond that and kept surprising me. There was a point when I told Wizards that one of the reasons why we got into this system where there's a current season, and so players play with the previous year or previous 2 years worth of cards, was because I told them that if they were in the business of designing cards, they were going to run out, but if they were in the business of designing environments, they could be evergreen. Um, and this was really driven home when Ice Age came out Ice Age had been worked on almost as long as it was. They had worked on Ice Age longer than the base set of Magic, because Ice Age began design maybe a year after Magic was created, but before it was published, and then it had been worked on that whole time. And so a lot of effort had been put into Ice Age, and passion and creativity, and it was a wonderful set. And when it came out, almost immediately there was like some Usenet articles saying that there was one card worth buying it for, and maybe two interesting cards, right? And so here, what they've done is they've designed this environment which is rich and filled with potential, and because everybody at the time was viewing it as, I'm adding it to my ongoing set, there's only one thing worth anything here. That's ridiculous. That's a lot of effort and a lot of creativity that's just being lost.
Yeah. I mean, that's an incredible insight, though, to say, because we do see the thing that happens a lot of times in the sets, especially when you think about standard or limited, where it's kind of like, well, they have the disenchant with the set mechanic on it, or they have the so-and-so, the shock with the set mechanic on it. And it's fascinating. One of the best things about those environments of Magic is to see how those cards change in value because of the set mechanics that are appended to them in ways that you don't really anticipate because of the environment, like you said. So it's a great insight to say, we're not just making cards, right? And we're not making for everything forever. We're making these kind of timed environments that are curated in themselves so that people can kind of enjoy them and enjoy Magic in a new way over and over again, which is certainly, I think, it's the thing that has kept me coming back for as long as I have, and I imagine it has for everybody else as well.
Yep.
You guys have any other questions about Magic before we kind of think about moving on?
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to hit with you, Richard, because you mentioned that you were somewhat recently at a tournament, and the idea of competition in Magic, and the players that you mentioned that used to be on Usenet, back when Dave and I were early preteens, right, on Usenet.
I remember reading the Legends spoiler, like the card list from a post on Usenet. I'm not sure how it got there, of course, but I remember going like, killer bees, amazing,
So how was the game designed for competition? Meaning, like, when in the testing, you said that players were just not putting it down and they were playing against each other, right? But what was the scale of competition that you had in mind?
Well, I viewed Magic as being a framework for gameplay, and my experience with frameworks for gameplay is that they could be played in lots of different ways. So, and so, as an example, there, like poker, right? There's all sorts of different versions of poker, and some of them are more casual, some of them more serious. There's a lot of different frameworks for poker as well, because not only is there Texas Hold'em, but there's the difference between Texas Hold'em pot limit, Texas Hold'em sort of limit, and Texas Hold'em tournaments with hundreds of people. And so I see basically any game which gets some popularity as having this potential to explore all these different things. Now, that's not to say that I thought at the beginning, there's going to be world championships, and I certainly didn't anticipate them being constructed then. I would have thought that it was more limited because I had this preconception of how people were going to play. So I didn't anticipate where it went, but I anticipated a flexible framework where you could send it into a lot of different places.
How do you view the large competitive scene that's been around for decades in Magic? How do you view its impact on the game that you created? Like, do you think it's a net positive, negative, both?
I think it's a net positive, but I don't think it can be both. I think it's a net positive, but there are some, but I know what you mean by both, because it's not a strictly good thing. I think on balance, though, it's a good thing. I was certainly one of the group that pushed for it. I was not the primary inspiration for it, but I was a strong supporter of it. And the idea was that if people are playing it seriously, that does not remove casual play any more than when you have the NBA, that makes it so that you don't have casual basketball. And so I saw this as being a way of making it flourish, because if you have this championship, you develop this more sophisticated conversation around the game, but you also open up these other avenues. Now, the part where it's negative is that I think there was more of a drag on the casual play than I expected. So in principle, right, you can still play around the kitchen table and so forth, but if around the kitchen table one of your players begins to take it very seriously, and that's the way you should play, they're going to begin to drive things, and that may change the tone of your game. So so that's where on balance I think it's a good thing, but it may not affect all play groups in a strong way, which is one of the reasons why I really liked the evolution of the Commander format, which was not something, of course, that was driven by Wizards, but it was being driven by this hole, which was left by a very serious tournament system. And I should say that when the tournaments began, it was incredible how fast the sophistication began. Before it, I don't know. I could go into any card game shop and I could beat most people with all common decks. And people would be coming up with the looniest, to me, with the looniest theories about what made a good card and why. After the Pro Tour began, it was a whole nother level. It was not, before that, the best players, I am sure, were at Wizards of the Coast. And I don't know how many months after that, they were clearly not the best players anymore at Wizards of the Coast.
That's fascinating.
I'm a little curious. This is sort of a follow-up to one of Shane's earlier questions regarding tournaments, because you mentioned that, obviously when the game first started, you didn't know there was going to be World Championships, Pro Tours, anything like that. But when the World Championships and the Pro Tours started happening, did you find yourself, was there any sort of principles or anything with regards to designing the game specifically that you felt you had to change or kind of tune a little bit differently because people were now playing at a much higher level?
Oh, yeah. It completely changed the nature of development. I think the bones of that development were already in place because the people who were driving the serious play were serious developers, and that's what they were thinking about. But when you look back, of course, to the original Magic as it was published and Arabian Nights, the tournament quality of the sets and the being designed for serious play, and also with the eye that you could only have 4 of a particular card because that became a standard. Those things really affected it, and so I'd say the tournament scene was the most important step in the most important thing that was informing our development.
So I know we only have a few more minutes of your time, so we want to shift away from Magic for a little bit, but I did want to ask you one question. Are you familiar with the fact that people on the internet like to use the phrase Magic as Richard Garfield intended?
I have run into that.
This?
Yes.
Would you like to shed any light on would you like to correct the record on what people think that Magic as Richard Garfield intended should be?
Well, I've seen that phrase, but I think it's used to apply to whatever the theory of the day is, and so I don't know if I can push them onto the right path. But the way, I guess I guess the way I intended it to be played was where players would take ownership of the game and play in formats and in ways that they liked. That the design was playful, combinatorial. I I wanted to see players given tools that they could figure out themselves rather than feel like there's combos out there for them to find. So there were a lot of cards back in the day that I created, which had no use in mind. And it was up to the players to find them, and maybe there was a way to use them, maybe there wasn't. So, and it was I don't know if that's realistic for Wizards to do these days, but back in the day, it was very exciting when you'd come out with, like, I don't know, the Copper Tablet or the Ankh of Mishra or some of these other sort of crazy things, and that might have done nothing for months, and then somebody came up with this crazy deck using it. Love that. That's what I like to see. Yeah. So I guess that's Magic as Richard Garfield intended it.
That's awesome. All right. Before we let you go, we did want to ask you about some other games other than Magic. One game that we would love to ask you about, because I believe that it's played a part in how Stan managed to get in contact with you, is Balatro.
Balatro is amazing.
Have you played a good amount of Balatro? It sounds like.
I when it came out, I killed it. I had people asking me how I got particular achievements. I did not get them all. Some of them were ridiculous. But
yes, they are.
But I did. But I did get a lot of them, and pushed it pretty far. And I'm sure people have gone way past it now. But yeah, no, I love the design. It's in a game design area I really like. I just gave a talk at the University of Sydney on luck in games, and it was I was revisiting it because I gave a talk, I don't know, 20 years ago on the same topic, and so I was sort of updating it. And one of the things I finished with was this array of digital games that were doing really exciting things with high variance games, and how it betrayed this we talked earlier about how I think 90% of this environment is good because I love a sophisticated audience, but there's this 10% thing where people get blinders and this is the way things should be done. In board games, I see that with regard to luck. People have these very, very restricted views about how luck should be used, how much there should be. And there's all these digital games which are really pushing it with things like Balatro and Luck Be a Landlord, and and these games, the thing about them is they've got crazy amounts of luck, but at the same time there's crazy amounts of skill, and
right.
For some reason in board games people think of them as being the opposite, like you can't have a lot of luck and a lot of skill at the same time, like they've never seen poker. But
yeah, I think that's a lot of people's kind of general perception of people who maybe don't play a lot of games. I think that's kind of their general perception. It's certainly sort of like a layperson's perception of poker in particular, but so many games. I'm so glad you brought up this luck idea, because one of my favorite things that I remember as far as content from you goes is the Three Donkeys podcast. I used to listen to it all the time. And I remember you had one great episode in particular where you talked about the nature of luck in games. And it's been talked about a lot, I feel like, since then, just about the fact that luck is kind of what helps lower skill players become enfranchised in the game as well while they're working their way up that curve. Or maybe they're people who don't even work up the skill curve, but they still love the game because luck lets them win sometimes. So I love that you brought that up. Is that relationship between luck and skill something that still drives when you're thinking about designing games now?
Yes, absolutely. I would say that of the many things I think about when I'm putting together a game, the one most common is how much variance should be there and how it should be dealt with, so that you don't want to have your players feel like they have no agency. I think that's what they often react to against luck, but so that there's also just a lot of depth to explore, but not so reliably that it divides up your play groups.
I feel like luck too. I'm just curious on your opinion on this and saying this perhaps a lot better or even disagreeing with me. But I feel like luck lets people, especially in like kind of the roguelite kind of games that you're describing, like Balatro or Luck Be a Landlord. I'm curious if you've played Slice and Dice yet. That's one that's very popular, like dice-based roguelite this year. And I feel like luck is the thing that makes people hit play just once more, like whether it's a single player or a multiplayer game. And it's like, well, this time maybe I'll get the thing that combo I was hoping for that didn't come until like way too late in the game or something like that. And I'm curious how you try to build that in, or how you think it should be built into multiplayer games, because I feel like it's somewhat straightforward to do it in a single player game, but multiplayer, balancing that concept of variance seems a lot more challenging.
Well, I mean, there's a bunch of things you can do.
Yes, that was a long question. I apologize. That's the worst interview question.
One of the things is just short play periods helps. So poker is great for that, right? Because it's in these bite-sized hands. Now, a poker tournament is a long and skillful game, but a poker hand is this short, skillful game, but with a lot of luck, which is on it. So you can either make your game short, and then people can play multiplayer, and they can have their skill shine through, but when it doesn't, they can play again. But then you can make longer games with luck too. The important thing, I think, there is that you provide people these little victories along the way. And so for instance, if you had a big economic game and you played for 2 hours, and then at the end it felt like you lost on a die roll, that might feel bad. But on the other hand, if that same game were such that there were, say, these 7 challenges you were competing over, and you won 2 of them, and you lost overall, you would have these little victories on the way. So it's like little sub games. So you can make longer games also, which have a lot of luck. You just have to arrange it so that somebody doesn't feel like the entire thing comes down to dice rolling at the end. But yeah.
So when you're designing games, because you've designed a number of games, a number of very successful games, like King of Tokyo, Robo Rally, things like that, right? Like Magic the Gathering. I think we've all heard of that one.
The Great Dalmoody. We haven't talked about that. A family favorite at my house. Honestly, I know it's a simple game, but
how do you know when you're onto something? And it sounded like it was pretty obvious with Magic, right? Like everything made sense. People were engaged. It fell out onto the table. Like when have things been more of a challenge, but you still think you're onto something that you want to keep exploring?
Since I'm generally not driven by making a game to be published, it's usually just whatever is interesting me. And if there's something there that I think is interesting, so when I put together a prototype, it's very often that it's a lot of fun to play once, but you know that you don't want to play it again. And so I enjoy that. That's a pastime of mine, and it's also something my friends and playtesters enjoy. They don't mind playing a game that they realize is not going to be good in the long run, but is also informative of how that game could develop. And so I just keep following that thread until I either get frustrated because I'm not getting it to where I want it, or or I get what I want, which is sometimes publishable, sometimes isn't. And oftentimes the games will go into the closet and I'll bring them out later when I've got a sort of fresh eye. But I view my game design often as experimentation, sort of seeing what happens and trying to come into it without expectations.
Really appreciate your time. I did want to ask, just for our own purposes, so mutual love of Balatro between all of us here on the call. Is there anything else that you've been really into in the last couple of months that you think we should try out? Maybe we haven't heard,
Richard.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that I can steer you to anything better than Balatro. Most of the games I'm playing right now are pretty old.
Perfect.
I adore Dwarf Fortress. And
You're a true rogue player, aren't you?
So,
you just like the roguelikes. I love this.
love
This is all I'm playing lately.
And I do have a game in playtest, Chaos Agents. And so that's been very interesting. Chaos Agents is an auto battler royale. So I like auto battlers as well. I think auto battlers are crazy interesting because for a long time I've been really interested in what games can fit in between what you might regard as classic video games, which are often like a simulation, and board games, because they're both games, they're both played for entertainment, but they feel like they're worlds apart. And these rogue games we've been talking about fit there, but so do these auto battlers. The auto battlers, like Hearthstone Battlegrounds, are I think they're wonderful. You sit back, you make some really interesting decision, and then you see what happens. The computer's very relevant, but at the same time, it feels like a board game. Anyway, to get back to Chaos Agents, that's what I'm trying to do there. I want to get an auto battler where you've got a lot of people playing at once.
I just submitted my email for the private invite-only alpha. I'm expecting my invite in the mail.
Oh, great.
Fingers crossed. We're pulling for you.
I had one more non-games, non-Magic related question. What's it like being related to a former U.S. president?
And is that true? We saw it on your Wikipedia page.
It is true. Yeah. My grandfather's grandfather was President Garfield, and yeah, I don't really know what to say about it beyond that.
It's just a thing.
What I know about him, I was pretty impressed, pretty happy to be to share something with him. But if you look into what he did, seems like a pretty stand-up guy.
That's great. Well, Richard, really appreciate your time that you spent with us today, and just really appreciate everything you've brought to this thing that we all share. Shane and I have known each other since elementary school, but Magic kind of allowed us to stay in touch after he moved from Chicago to Denver, where he lives now. I really Stan and Devin and the rest of us kind of only know each other because of Magic, and we really formed a friendship. We've made this podcast, it's the 300th episode. We have a whole community of people who talk to each other about Magic, but about other stuff too. We have a Discord where everybody hangs out, and so it's been. I just wanted to thank you on behalf of everybody for kind of the seed that started it all in a lot of ways. And I'm sure there's lots of other people out there like us who share similar stories. So, thanks for being a part of this 300th episode.
Yeah,
with
truly
us. Really
appreciate it.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's always fun to talk about games in general and Magic in specific.
Well, that does wrap up this week's show. A very special show indeed. There's a chance we got some new listeners from people who like Magic. Maybe they haven't heard of us. Maybe you don't really pay attention to the formats that we cover. We primarily talk about Modern and Pioneer, but we do come out every week. And if you'd like to hear future episodes of The Dive Down, make sure you subscribe wherever you get podcasts. Apple, Spotify, Pocket Casts, you name it. Google Pods, does that still exist?
It doesn't
Maybe.
actually. I think it
Okay.
actually literally doesn't exist.
If you'd like to submit a question to us, we can't forward it to Richard, but we can talk about podcasting magic or modern, I suppose. You can tweet us at the Dive Down, all one word, or email thedivedown@gmail.com. We do have a Patreon. You can support us at patreon.com/thedivedown. We even have a store at thedivedown.com/store with some swag. Head over to heavyplay.com to get some incredible deck and dice boxes and playmats featuring the EquipMag system. If you use promo code TheDiveDown2024, you'll get 10% off your first order at heavyplay.com. We can also save you a little bit of money when playing Magic online with Mana Traders. If you use promo code TheDiveDown10, all one word, all letters, it'll get you 10% off your first 2 months of renting Magic Online cards over at Mana Traders. We can even save you a little bit of money on paper cards from our friends at Nerd Rage Gaming with promo code DIVE8, the number 8, and that'll get you 8% off your order from NRG. Special thanks to the bands Nowhere and Spaceblood for letting us use their music in this show. And until next week, get out there and play Magic as the good doctor intended.